Hello to you, my friend, and a warm welcome to you wherever you may be in the world. Time is finally here. It's time for the long-awaited Songs of Faith and Devotion album review as part of my ongoing Depeche Mode album review series. Now, what you're about to see is footage which was released almost a year ago, well, it was early last year, on watchvg.com. Now, watchvg.com was set up to be a locals area for people who like my content to enjoy a more intimate and ad-free experience. I wanted a platform where I could present the content in a way that was not bound by YouTube red tape. For instance, typically the videos on watchvg.com, there'll be a little bit of swearing. I tend to let my hair down a bit, like have a drink and stuff. So a lot of the things that aren't allowed on YouTube, we do in watchvg.com. So why am I telling you this? Well, what you're about to see now are the original episodes which were released on watchvg.com early last year, but they have been kind of cut and trimmed to fit in line with YouTube guidelines, so they do not include original music. There are times where I go on to demonstrate something and it'll just cut to a blank screen. The reason for that is because here on YouTube, you are not allowed to play copywritten material. It is important that I tell you that so that you understand. So if you really want the real in-depth experience, do check out watchvg.com. It's a great way for you to support my work, but also for you to experience the content in the way I always intended it to be presented. But within that, I'm sure you will find that the cut down versions here on YouTube will give you a lot of the information and a lot of the stuff which you expect from this channel. And with that out the way, let's get started. Do enjoy. Hello and welcome to watchvg.com. This is part one of the long-awaited Songs of Faith and Devotion album review series. And this episode, part one, we're talking about a different approach. And what I mean by that is every album that Depeche Mode made, although they started off as a four-piece electronic band, there was this kind of evolvement. There was always a conscious desire to push the frontiers of what they were doing, to innovate, to move things forward, and to not repeat what they have done. Of course, fast forward that to the last three albums, there's been a lot of repeating what they've done, but we don't want to bash them. Let's stay on topic. The approach to this record was very, very different. Whereas the previous records, it was all about pre-production. Martin would obviously have a studio at home, and he would produce a lot of the stuff by himself, and a lot of his demos are online. You'll be happy to know that here in watchvg.com I'm going to do a lot of videos on the demos. I've got a series I'm busy toying with called From Demo to Completion, where we listen to the demo and then we listen to the finished product and we discuss how it started and where it ended up. I think that's going to be a very interesting series. But certainly with Martin going into the studios in his home studio doing the pre-production and then coming to the meetings where they had the pre-production meetings, there was always some pre-production done. Now, as it's said in the documentaries, and I'm sure you've watched that documentary with me on the previous video, Prelude 2, they spoke about how there was no pre-production session in this record. But I think in hindsight, whatever mistakes were made or whatever, we got this record and it was groundbreaking. It was absolutely epic and massive. So the approach here very different. It wasn't about, programming and layering things upon things. It was about going into a studio and just working like a lot of real bands do, where you jam and you record something and then you get it wrong and you play it again. And so a lot of the approach here was to record pieces of performance, live chunks of performance. For instance, whereas if we take like Violator, you'd program, let's say, the bass line, dun 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 dun, and then quantize it, and then put the tick 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 tick. You'd layer everything and then move. That's how electronic production is done. It's layering upon layering, and then just programming things in. With this though, it was more about capturing not only acoustic spaces as well, which was something that Gareth Jones taught them, and of course something Dave Bascombe said he would like to take credit for was introducing the band to the idea of feedback. And what I mean by feedback, I'm talking about guitar feedback. So if you listen to the albums, Music for the Masses is really the first album where you really sort of hear a lot of use of like guitar feedback and stuff like that. Of course, fast forward to Songs of Faith and Devotion now, guitar feedback is huge. There is so much emphasis and use of guitar feedback. I love guitar sound. I often love using guitar sound so that it doesn't sound like a guitar, but it sounds like a special effect. We did that a lot on my Dark Society record. Shameless self-promotion there. Hey man, it is my channel. So there was a lot of use of guitar sound here, and running sounds through guitar amps and things like that. Hell of a lot of production and innovation, as always. Now, this new approach, as Alan said, which was quite alien to them at the time, was probably one of the reasons why there was so much tension. It was a very, very different way of working, but that, of course, in tandem with the band and, Dave with his drugs and their health, and just situations in life, just general stuff that were going on around the band, just made this a very difficult record. And this has all been well documented. But I think if they had gone into the studio and they were like happy chaps like they were in the mid-80s, this record would have ended up sounding very different. So as Alan said, sometimes through adversity, you create your best work. So I think all the drama and turmoil was a very, very important part of the fact that this record sounded the way it did. Alan spoke in the documentary how you can take the human performance element and combine that with modern production techniques and thereby develop a more interesting sound.
Violate is very programmed still. There's lots of individual sampled sounds, but they're all programmed on the exact beats in the bar, whereas later we would use chunks of performance that had all the inherent mistakes and humanity. The combination of using all that modern technology with all that character is what makes more interesting music.
If we look at all the albums preceding this period, every album was really pretty much programmed. It was played in and then sequenced and, layered and what. But this approach, albeit very alien to them, meant that you would, for instance, in the case of the drum kit, Alan would play the drum part. Now imagine human beings playing a drum kit. It doesn't matter how good you are, you're going to be playing to a click track. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. You just keep you in time. But no matter how good a player you are, you're human, so you're never going to be 100% on the mark. Sometimes you're going to be a little bit off, and this is what gives this record its ebb and flow. It doesn't have that metronomic 1, 2, 3, 4, that rigid kind of feel. Now, I'm not saying the previous stuff was rigid. I mean, Gareth Jones does talk about a lot of tempo changes being used in a lot of the records, and tempo changes meaning they would program the tempo change. So I think in Black Celebration, I will do more detail on this in a later video. Some of the songs, like Fly on the Windscreen, it's not the same tempo all the way through. They would variate it. And this is interesting because I see even these days in modern production, especially in electronic production, usually producers pick a tempo and they just, if the song starts off at 120, it usually ends at 120. I certainly don't do that. In shout out, when I do my music, I like to variate tempos throughout the song, where appropriate, of course. And Gareth was also saying that is something that is not often done these days with, tempo variation. Bring back tempo variation. But anyway, back to the production of this record. So you can imagine Alan playing those drums, also bearing in mind that Alan wasn't a drummer. He sort of taught himself how to play drums at this period, went on tour, played the drums, and played them better than Christian Eigner plays them as far as I'm concerned. Sorry, the fact that Alan wasn't a world-class drummer did not matter. He understood the groove and he understood the music and he knew how to drum. He knew what this music needed. And that is shamefully lost these days. But anyway, so you can imagine, instead of programming everything, and even on the song like Walking My Shoes has got that bass part, dunga 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 digga digga. Now that is a real bass part. I believe Alan played that from what I have been told. But also you must remember, whereas on a previous album that bass part would have been programmed, Now you've got the recording of the ding-a-ding-a-ding. So you've got that human feel of the bass. So he would multi-record it. He just as you would record vocals, he'd play it once, then he'd play it twice, maybe play it 6 times or whatever. And then he would choose the segment which felt the best, and then that would be imported into the section, into the session. Now, with that approach comes the humanity. And once again, no matter how good a bass player you are never going to be 100% on time. So the cumulative effect of all these parts played in by human hands, with the exception of the sequences and things like that, I don't want to get misleading here, but it is the cumulative effect of all these human parts put together that give this record. It's just got this edge where, and if you load the songs into a DAW, which is a digital audio workstation, you will notice how they don't 100% hit the bar. There's this movement and this ebb and flow, and it's beautiful. This is a beautiful way to make music, and I think Alan Wilder understood this, is that you combine the elements of technology combined with the elements of human performance, bring that together, and that is the magic formula for great music. It's certainly the way I like to work. I don't want to put myself on this level, but it's definitely inspired my workflow, and it's the way I like to teach people to work as well, as opposed to just programming everything. The mouse is not your friend. The human element of that imperfection, of the human expression on the instruments combined with the electronics, is what gave this sound, this record, its sound, and the reason it sounds the way it does. So what I've put together for you now is a video where I go to my DAW and I've loaded 2 Depeche Mode songs in, one from Violator and one from Songs of Faith and Devotion. And I'm going to do a very, very simplistic explanation to kind of illustrate what I've just said. How the production changed between Violator and all the previous albums and this album, Songs of Faith and Devotion. How the programming, although important, kind of took a back step so that human performance and, all the inherent mistakes that come with being a human could actually take the forefront and the center stage for the production of this album. Roll the tape. Right, and here we are at the DAW. A DAW, in other words, DAW, it simply stands for Digital Audio Workstation. Now, obviously, there are a lot of producers in my community, but I'm going to make this as straightforward, and I'm assuming that there are people in here that do not understand music production. So if it's a little bit elementary for you, just understand that I'm trying to make this video as inclusive and as straightforward for everyone to understand. And it's particularly aimed at people really who, don't understand music production and things like that. So I will keep my explanations straight and concise and as to the point as what I can. So this is a program called Logic Audio, and it's one of the most popular sequencing programs in the world, for music production. But we're not going to go too much into that. Really what I want to point out is I've got 2 tracks loaded here. I've got Depeche Mode's World in My Eyes, and I've got Walking in My Shoes. World in My Eyes, obviously, from the Violator album, and Walking in My Shoes from the Songs of Faith and Devotion album. And the whole idea of this little walkthrough is to sort of show you the different approaches that were done. Now, obviously, Violator, one of their most outstanding albums of all time, was a very sort of metronomic album. And what I mean by that is it's very sort of, as Alan said on one of the documentaries, he said it's very sort of like programmed, and exactly every sound is programmed to the exact beats on the bar. Whereas Walking in My Shoes, which is obviously on the SoFad album, a lot more sort of rocky and a lot more sort of jammed and played, so to speak, which was a completely different approach for this band. So let me quickly start off by opening World in My Eyes. I'm going to just quickly play it, and then what I have over here is a BPM counter, and this just calculates the tempo of the track for me. I guess it's variating a little bit, but I mean it's basically at about 122.2, which I've taken the liberty of doing just slightly earlier on. There we go, change it to 122.2. Now, typically you wouldn't work at, intervals of 122.2. You would probably just put it at 122. But for the purposes of this, I want to be as accurate as possible, so I'm going to go with 122.2. Okay, so quickly just muting this track, I'm going to arm the metronome, and as I push play now, you will just hear the metronome, and the metronome will be playing at a BPM of 122.2. Okay, now what I've done earlier on, just because to save time, I've taken this track, World in My Eyes, and I've lined it up with the beats in the bar. Now, watch as we play this metronome here. You see how it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are the bars, and these are, that's a bar, that's a bar, that's a bar, and there are obviously like 4 beats to a bar. And you can actually see that's the click 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So the metronome hits it on every bar. So really what that means is I need to line this track up with the exact beats of the bar, and as you can see, I've done that already. So if we just quickly zoom out here, there's the, as you can see, that's the first transient there. So what I want to point out to you is here, if we just quickly zoom in on the audio file here, you can see how this moves exactly with the bar. And you can actually hear the click going exactly, precisely in time with it. So you see it's pretty much, metronomically on the bar. Now, I'm going to quickly jump to Walking in My Shoes. Obviously a very different type of song. Once again, I've lined this up. Okay, so this one's at about 93. So I'm going to quickly just change the grid to 93. And as we did with World in My Eyes, I have, before I recorded this, I just lined this up to the exact beats in the bar. But what you will notice with this is, although it's on the bar, it has this kind of drift to it, where it's not 100%, although it's pretty accurate. And I suppose you'd probably only hear it if you have a trained ear. Just listen how this kind of it's on the bar, but it has kind of like this groove. It's not actually just 100% metronomic. Put the metronome on. So you can hear it's 1, 2, 3. It's on the bar, but it's kind of dun 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 dun. It's kind of like dancing around the grid a little bit. Whereas if you listened to World in My Eyes, it was dun 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 dun. It was completely on the bar. Now this is just how sequencing works. With electronic music, typically you always go for precision, but with the evolvement of electronic music, I personally am more into what I like to call hybrid styles. Hybrid styles meaning, where you combine electronic elements with acoustic elements and capturing the performance. And this was very, very instrumental in Songs of Faith and Devotion, was that recording and capturing, the performance, as opposed to just having everything perfectly played back by a sequencer. Now, I'm quickly going to just illustrate to you in a very simplistic way how the grid would work. Now I'm going to quickly play a few notes in from World in My Eyes. Now this, what I have over here, this is called an ES2. It's basically a plug-in or a soft synth. It's basically, that means for you non-musicians out there, it's basically a musical instrument built inside the computer. So imagine it's exactly the same as having a keyboard, but this is actually having it built inside the computer, if that makes any sense. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly change this grid back to 122, I think, yeah, because I want to, okay, 122.2 is what World in My Eyes was at. Now I just want to quickly demonstrate to you in a very simplistic way how this would have been programmed. So typically what you would do is you would play the parts in, and then you would sequence them using the sequencer. So in order to do that, I'm just going to quickly pull up the ES2, which is already there, and I've just got a generic bass sound here. This is not the original bass sound, obviously. This is just for demonstrational purposes. I must just also quickly say that when I play it, my playing is going to be a little bit out of time because there's I'm monitoring the audio from a different output, and anyway, I don't want to get too geeky. Anyway, Vaughn, you've got nothing to prove. Your community know you can play. Alright, so what I do is here, I'm going to hit record, and I'm just going to play in the bass part. Here we go. Okay, that was not too bad considering the latency issue and everything. So really, this is what you would do. You would have a metronome playing and you would play the parts in. Now there's different ways of doing it, but I don't want to go off track. You could, if you wanted to, pull up a little pencil and you could just draw the notes in. But that's not typically how Depeche Mode would have done it back then. Remember, Martin did produce the demos, and a lot of the demo parts, the MIDI parts from the demos, were used on the original recordings. Anyway, let's not jump ahead of ourselves here. So let's look at this part that I've just recorded. Here it is. If I double click on this part here, it brings us into the editor over here. Now these are the parts I've played, the notes I've played, and you can see this is what we call the piano roll. So let's just push play and hear how I played that. Okay, as you can hear, it's a bit sloppy, a bit out of time. So this is typically what you would do in electronic music, and this was definitely the approach done in Violator, bearing in mind that they were using slightly different technology at the time, but of course this kind of grid and sequencing technology was available back then. I'm not sure what program they were using. You geeks can probably help me. I don't know if they were using Cubase or what. Let's not get distracted. So really, you've heard that now, so it's a little bit out of time. So what you would typically do with this is now, you would select all those notes, and you would want to quantize them. Now, what the quantize function is, it basically moves all the notes that you've played to the nearest grid, you know, to the nearest bar on the grid. And typically what you'd want to do is you would need to select the, you know, whether it's an 8th or a quarter or a 16th note. Here we're going to go with an 8th note. And did you see how it just moved all the notes to the exact point? If I click undo quickly, that's where they were. I'll watch again. If I hit quantize, it moves them 100%. Now listen to this. So as you can hear, that sounds pretty, well, you know, it's not the right sound, but it sounds, you know, sort of groove-wise, it sounds closer to the record than as opposed to when I just played it in by hand. So I'm going to undo it one more time. And this is the way I played it. And let's select the notes again and hit select all the notes and hit quantize. And we hit quantize and you can hear it. So as you can see, it's moved them all to the exact beats on the bar. And if I play it back, much better. Now, of course, you can get very creative with this. I don't want to turn this into a music production tutorial, but there are functions in modern DAWs where you can select all and you can sort of go to a function MIDI transform here, and you've got functions here where you can click humanize, and what that does is it kind of humanizes this, and what that means is it takes it a little bit off the bar just to make it more sort of sound like it was played more humanly. But of course, depending on what type of music you're going for, certainly in the case of Violator that was not the case. They were going for a very sort of, you know, a very sort of strict metronomic type sound. Of course, selecting all the notes there, you've got the strength slider here. If we move it back to 0, that's essentially how I played it. So this basically, moving it from the left to the right, as you see it goes from 0 to 100, this slider basically allows you to select how strong you want the quantize function to be. Obviously, if we take it down to 0, it's going to be exactly the way I played it. There, it's going to collect, it's going to sort of, do a 20%. And you will notice as I move this from left to right, as I move it closer to 100, notice how these notes move closer to the bar. You see it's more accurate, more accurate, more accurate. So this, if you take it to about 66, 67, that could be, just listen. 67, that's basically like 2/3. So that is essentially, if you listen to that, so it's basically what I played, but it's bringing it closer to perfection, or, the quantize function can be used really just, very creatively. So if you want the music to be not be too robotic, you would move it to about somewhere between 50 and 60, or, depending what you want to do. Of course, in the case of Violator, I believe this would have been 100%. And I'm basing this really on the documentary of Songs of Faith and Devotion, where Alan Wilder said, with Violator, everything was programmed to the exact beats on the bar. And really, this is where Songs of Faith and Devotion was very, very different. And in the examples that I played you earlier on, you could hear how World in My Eyes is very sort of faithful to the grid. 1, 2, 3, 4. It really hits the bar, hits it on the mark. Whereas Walking in My Shoes, and of course it's not out of time, it's in time, but you can hear it has this kind of drifting, it kind of drifts around the note. And it is that approach to music production which is a lot more appealing to me personally. This is why I loved the Songs of Faith and Devotion album. I just love dirty sound, and I love the combination of, combining electronics with real instruments and getting that human performance into a recording as opposed to just programming everything. So there we go. I hope that made sense. That was just a very, very straightforward way of explaining it to you. And let's jump back out into the real world. And there you have it. I hope that I've made myself clear. I sometimes over-explain things, but it's just very important that I explain myself properly. Some people think I'm condescending, but that's never my intention. I just like people to understand what I'm saying. Because very often I speak to people and I don't understand what they're saying. Maybe it's because I'm not very bright. But I always like people to understand what I'm saying. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section. In part 2, we're going to take this even further, and we're going to talk about the sound of Songs of Faith and Devotion. I'm Vaughn George. This is WatchVG.com. I'll see you in the next video. Lots of love. Adios.